I do believe that mass formation in many respects should be considered a state of madness. And I know that I just said that I don't use the term psychosis.
Yep.
But if you mean with madness a process in which an individual participates in something that might lead to his own destruction, then I would say that it is a kind of madness. And I think it is even important to consider it like that, because I think that whether you go along with the masses or whether you defy the masses, in both scenarios, you might very well become the victim of the masses. And, Stalin, for instance, started to he eliminated in the end 60% of the members of his own Communist Party without them having the possibility to prevent them from being eliminated, because it was almost at random that he picked them and that he condemned them to death. And in the same way, I think that is exactly what is so important to realize, that you never have to try to destroy the masses. In the end, they will always just exhaust themselves, potentially destroy themselves. But what you should focus on is preventing that they destroy you. And that's if you look at the psychological from a psychological perspective, if you look at the mechanism, then you can see that the most crucial thing, I always repeat that's the most important message I can bring at this moment, is that the better you understand the psychological mechanism of mass formation, the more you understand that it is just crucial that the dissonant voices continue to speak out. And why? Because by continuing to speak out, you exactly prevent that the madness of the masses and their leaders becomes complete, and that the masses end up in the state in which they become so fanatically convinced that everyone who goes against them is actually inhumane, lacks solidarity, lacks citizenship, is irrational, and so on, and consequently should be destroyed exactly because he is so inhumane. So that this, I think, the entire process for me shows that we are dealing with a process which leads people to a complete blindness, a complete self-destructiveness, and a complete absurdity, in which you should always consider as a kind of a state in which people, in which the mental capacities of people are very limited. I think that many people try to explain mass formation from the perspective of just follow the money and you will understand why they do it, or just realize that there are power-hungry individuals who want to be in charge of everything. I agree with Hannah Arendt that is not right. The typical characteristics of totalitarian leaders is not that they are after the money or not that they want more and more power. The typical characteristic of a totalitarian leader is his radical ideological blindness. The radical ideological blindness which pushes him to impose his ideology to the collective and to society, no matter what the cost is, even if it means that he will be killed himself, that he will lose everything. The typical totalitarian leader will typically continue trying to impose his ideology to society. And then at the lower levels of a totalitarian state, you find psychopaths, perverts, people who are after the money, people who want power, and so on. But the top level is characterized by ideological blindness, I think.
Okay. Here is the crux of our disagreement. And let me just say, I hope the better argument wins, right? If it's your argument, that will in one way be comforting to me, and I'm happy to go there. But I am going to try to persuade you that what is madness at the individual level is not madness at the collective level, and that evolutionarily speaking, that collective level matters more, which is why we see the pattern. And first, I want to go back to something you said, and I want to pressure test it a little bit. So you said that the indicator, tell me if I've got your meaning wrong here, I'm paraphrasing you, but you said that the indicator that this was madness was that people were willing to engage in behaviors that put them in danger of destruction. Is that effectively right?
Yes.
Okay. But if we take that same logic, if I say, well, you know, is a player of American football, are they engaged in madness? Because they are taking substantial risks of harms to their cognitive capacity, to their, ability to move around in the world. They might even sustain a very serious injury, a crippling one.
That's a good question. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So I'll just fast forward. Obviously, they're not crazy. We can explain their behavior from the point of view of the rewards that they get outweigh the risks that they take, or at least in their mind, it seems likely that they do. Is that fair?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. What about a soldier who goes into battle, right? Knows that they may not come back, right? This is a person engaged in a very dangerous behavior, yet, obviously in wartime, you can be shot for deserting. In peacetime or something like peacetime, the rewards that are offered to your family make it sensible. We can say the same. We can say something similar in the even more radical case of a kamikaze pilot or a suicide bomber, that there is an analysis whereby, if we just take the trivial version, is it worth taking a substantial risk or maybe even volunteering for a suicidal mission if it puts your family at sufficient advantage? Let's say that your family was very jeopardized and you engage in some behavior and you're gone, but the position of your children is so much better than it would have been that the rationality is apparent. It's brutal, right? We may not like that it's there, but it's comprehensible, right? So are you with me so far?
Yeah, yes, I am definitely. Yes.
Okay. So I have one other piece of my history that I want to introduce here. When I was an undergraduate, I was working with one of the great 20th century evolutionary biologists, a guy named Bob Trivers. And I wrote a paper, the final paper that I wrote in his class was on the Holocaust. And the purpose of my paper was to look into the claim that Hitler was a madman. This was something I heard very often as a young person growing up, far closer to World War II than I realized at the time. I obviously knew how many years it was, but it seemed a long time ago. And now, obviously, we're more than twice as far out. The upshot of that paper was that Hitler was a monster, as everyone knows. And I believe that as strongly as anyone, maybe more strongly. But what he did was not evolutionarily irrational. From the point of view of his gene pool, it may very well have been rational. And this, when I raise this point, it always puts me in an awkward position with people because they hear some kind of defense of it in there. And I mean the opposite. What I mean is, if you're going to prevent this, you have to understand why it happens. And so in any case, my point here is I've been interested in the question of why this takes place for a very long time. Until I ran into your work, I didn't know that there was this body of thought that apparently goes back to before the beginning of the 20th century on mass formation. And so I've been looking at it from an evolutionary perspective almost strictly. But these two things collide, right? They're, it's a question of consilience, I think. Consilience meaning when you happen onto the same story from different disciplines and, there's a way to reconcile them. And suddenly you have a much more complete picture because, what you're describing is a process of individual psychology in which an individual appears to be utterly mad because they're saying things that cannot be squared with reality, and they appear to be completely committed to them, even though they are putting themselves in great danger by subscribing, right? Mm-hmm. And then, in psychology, you can see, well, okay, but psychology is an individual phenomenon, but there is a group manifestation. There is something about group psychology that is also very real, even though we can't put it in an fMRI machine and scan it, right? But it's there. It clearly is a fact. And then what I'm saying is, from an evolutionary perspective, we have the same dichotomy. We have the individual and their fitness. And what we fail to do well is understand the lineage and its fitness. And I believe that the solution to the puzzle that you're pointing to, the madness of these immense numbers of people, is actually a diabolical rationality. And that, I'm sure you and I are completely aligned in being terrified by this process. And the question is it worth discovering the nature of lineage psychology, discovering that Hannah Arendt's correct belief that these ideologies destroy themselves isn't really comforting if this is the mechanism a lineage uses to get through a historical bottleneck. Is that making sense?
I think so, yes. But I'm interested in learning more about this diabolic rationality of the masses. Can you?
Yes.
What way is it rational? Because I still don't understand in what way you consider it rational.
Well,
you mean rational from the point of view of the supra-organism, this larger organism that the masses?
Rational. So I must tell you, you will be well aware of the naturalistic fallacy, right? If I describe that something is a product of evolution, I'm not defending it. And in fact, although humanity's best characteristics are all products of evolution, so are all of our worst characteristics. And I think it is our obligation to augment and amplify the honorable characteristics and to banish the evil ones. But I don't want to pretend that they're not comprehensible. They're quite comprehensible.
Yes.
And so, the point is, look, let's say that Hitler had succeeded. Right. Let's say that he had exterminated the Jews, and then maybe he branched out and, he had left the continent of Europe Aryan, maybe left the world Aryan. Right. From the point of view of the genes in his genome, that would have been a massive win. 5,000 years after it had happened, he might have been largely, forgotten, right? The average person might have the same relationship with Hitler that I have with Caligula, right? I can barely explain who that is. And so the point is, the genes are not overly concerned about what the people who have those genes are saying or thinking at any moment. The question is, how do I get into the future? And one way to get into the future is to eliminate people who share fewer of those genes and to promote people who have more of them. And so, if Hitler had gone after people who parted their hair on the left versus the right, that would be a paradox. But because what he did is he went after people who would, if they were eliminated, be replaced by people who were more closely related to him. This is a genetically comprehensible strategy, right? It is, in fact, highly effective. And so I don't want us to get lost in the fact that Hitler was dead wrong about the genetic superiority of the people that he was advancing. But genes don't care about this. Genes want their particular spellings to get into the future, even if the gene, if we're talking about two genes for a respiratory enzyme, and one of those genes is 50% more efficient, the one that's less efficient still wants to get into the future and destroy its competitor. I mean, I use want very loosely. Obviously, they don't really want anything, but they behave as if they want these things. And both versions of the gene want to get into the future. They're not really interested in finding out which gene is more effective. They don't care.
Okay, can I respond to that?
Please.
Yes. You know, in my two-centered opinion, you now think that you imagine a Hitler who acts and thinks in a rational way, and who indeed starts a program of protecting genes and so on, and who succeeds in implementing this rational program. But the problem is, I think, that this process of mass formation seems rational sometimes, but it isn't. In this respect, that, for instance, Hitler started eliminating the gypsies, the Jews, then he wanted to eliminate the Polish people, the Lithuanians, all the people with limitations in Germany, and also all the people with heart problems, lung problems were on his list. All the Germans with heart problems, lung problems. And I think that history has shown us that if this process continues, it starts to become completely irrational. Also from the perspective of the ideology of the one who is leading the masses. And exactly because the real function of this process of mass formation is not so much imposing a rational ideology to the world. The real function of this process is to handle and to control anxiety, frustration, and aggression. And this process continues. There is something in the process of mass formation which makes that it can never stop. Because first the masses, as the masses emerge, they have one object of anxiety that is indicated in a narrative, and they try to destroy this object of anxiety. But as soon as they succeed in destroying this object of anxiety, what they will find out is that they need a new object of anxiety, simply because the masses themselves don't want to wake up, because they would be confronted again with all this disconnectedness and all this frustration, aggression, anxiety. So the want the mass formation to continue. The leaders know that the mass formation must continue, because otherwise they will be killed by the masses themselves. If the masses wake up, they will typically destroy their leaders. So both the masses and the leaders know that the phenomenon of mass formation should not stop, meaning that after they have destroyed the first object of anxiety, they have to find a second object of anxiety which can be destroyed, and then a third, a fourth, a fifth, and so on. So, and now we see that in the end, this process of mass formation, in my opinion, is not so much, while it seems as if the masses and their leaders and the totalitarian state try to impose a rational ideology, for instance, the selection of the optimal genes, to the population, what really drives them is the handling, is their own anxiety and their own problems at the level of disconnectedness, meaning that, and their attempt to deal with their anxiety and their attempt to create a new connection is always a symptomatic one, and in the end always fails, just because the masses do not create new connection between individuals. As I explained 10 minutes ago or something, they create a connection between the individual and the collective, meaning that in the end I think that mass formation is always a kind of a symptom. It's a symptom that which develops in an organism, for instance in a society, in which in the initial stage seems to solve a problem, but which in the end becomes fatal and destructive for the organism that develops a symptom. So I think you can perfectly compare it to a tumor. And in this respect, I think that the selection of genes could be fruitful and selective if it happened outside a phenomenon of mass formation, in a truly enlightened mind. there it could be something rational that leads to good results. But the problem is that as soon as it becomes the ideology of a mass, it will, I think, always be counterproductive and in the end lead to the destruction of also the masses themselves.